let's get started with our first guest. After founding Songkick, which was based right here in East London, he founded Plural platform, which is an early stage fund, and he's also chair of the UK government's AI Foundation Model Task Force. Please welcome Ian Hogarth. Welcome, Ian. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Nice to be here.
Cool. Well, Ian, let's get to know you a little bit. Your first claim to fame was founding Songkick. Why did you move into AI? And is there anything that you learned as a founder in the Songkick experience that you're still using today?
So I guess my love affair with AI started in 2002 when I built my first robot, which is always a rite of passage, I think, for people who fall in love with AI. And then worked on early computer vision systems at Cambridge in 2004. And I think basically I just knew it wasn't ready for prime time. The applications of computer vision felt like they were mostly military. And I knew I wanted to build something, and so ended up building a consumer internet company because it felt like another of my love affairs was with music and with the internet. And so, although I didn't build an AI company then, Songkick did have we got to use AI under the hood from very early on because we were basically taking in all this unstructured text from the internet and trying to figure out, from in a given sentence, what's the name of a band, what's the name of a venue, what's the date, and basically doing smart parsing of large amounts of unstructured text. And so, I had a background in machine learning. Our earliest CTO, Phil Cowens, he had a PhD in machine learning, worked on the Dasher system at Cambridge for Stephen Hawking. Dan Quine, who you know from his time at Google, also had a kind of PhD and background in machine learning. So we always sort of had it as I think I just basically hired people who like machine learning, maybe just to keep the dream alive a bit. But it was sort of like a consumer internet company that every now and then tried to find an application of machine learning.
Very cool. Well, if you were building Songkick today with LLMs, is there anything you would do differently?
I think honestly, if I was given, I just wouldn't build Songkick again. Obviously, I'm glad I did because I think it's important to follow your youthful naivety and dreams. But the structural challenges we face were mostly just down to the fact that the market has one of the most dominant monopolists on the planet. And so, Ticketmaster's Live Nation just has incredible control over the market. And it's a very, very challenging market to innovate that has largely repelled all innovation for the last 30 years. So I'm not sure that AI is enough to do something about that right now. I think, honestly, if you were going to try to do Songkick again, you'd basically raise a lot more capital and have a much more aggressive sort of rights disruption strategy. But yeah.
Okay, well, let me ask the question slightly differently. If you were starting some other consumer internet company today with LLMs, how do you think you might approach it differently than you did back then?
I think the first thing I think is just trying to do more with fewer people. I think there's that magic period of a startup when there's 5 to 10 of you. Mm-hmm. And I always tell founders, when they're in the kind of sub 20 people range, just you will look back and be that was the best bit. And I think obviously there's amazing things about scale, but I think the sheer sense of fun and intimacy when everyone holds the whole company in their head and you have this camaraderie because you're usually in a bunch of outsiders that no one is really believing can do anything yet. Mm. That period is just, I think, exceptionally magic, and I think you can prolong it with access to these tools. I think you could, there's a engineer that I know who has basically just every time he thought about making a hire has just tried to automate more of the stuff and has really pushed this idea of the Instagram, I think, kind of found, got going with the idea of leveraging the cloud more. Midjourney is obviously really tiny company relative to the scale and impacts of their business. So I think that would be probably the cultural thing I would do differently is try to hire fewer engineers and see what happened. And then I think in terms of what you build, I think I would personally be going after cyber physical systems, not an internet company because I just love fusion, materials discovery, that kind of thing.
Cool. Well, talking about real world application of technology, you shared how you've been working with AI or alongside AI for 20 years. I heard that you built a vision system to analyze radiology images back in 2004, but you just didn't have enough imaging data or the kind of technology wasn't quite there. But with today's technology, there's another London-based company, Chiron Medical, that were able to make the idea work to detect breast cancer just last year. Are there any other 20-year-old ideas that you worked on back in 2004 that you think are going to be unlocked with AI this year? or in the coming 18 months?
I'm very excited about robotics. I remember one of the projects that I was most inspired by was this project called BabyBot, and it was like in Italy around 2006, so I guess close to 20 years, and they were really trying to sort of emulate how a baby's kind of sensory experience expands, and then how they learn motor controls, like sense of kind of being grounded in the world. And so I think there's some really interesting stuff just to be done around like embodied systems. There's this incredible world-leading academic, Carl Friston, who's done a lot of work on this idea of the free energy principle. And there's teams at UCL that have kind of grown up under him who are really thinking about this idea of like embodied AI as a fundamental challenge. So I think that robotics is probably the one that feels the most like it might happen in the next few years in a way that will surprise people. And I think like if ChatGPT was a really big update for a lot of people around the capability of these systems, like wait till you have like robots doing like consumer tasks.
So what are they going to be? Are they going to be humanoids that are in your house doing your cleaning and your cooking, or how is that going to come to pass?
I'm personally very inspired by domestic robots, just because like, I tell my son like, imagine if we didn't have a dishwasher and a washing machine and a stove and an oven, all these tools that we take for granted, and the number of hours that I would have to be spending doing things that I can now spend with you or other things and so there's something kind of magic about like domestic labor-saving tasks, and I'm personally, that's the one that excites me the most. I think though that humanoids are just incredibly expensive, right? You've got this like massive overhead of having something that can walk upstairs or whatever, right? And that just doesn't seem, it seems like the sort of thing that like will work in a decade, but I would be looking to like slightly more cut down, simplified things before that just exploit like simpler systems.
Thinking about some other areas of innovation, we've seen some real leaps forward in content generation just in the last few weeks. Think about Sora for videos and Suno V3 for audio. If you haven't checked that out, check it out. On your blog, you have a great annual recap for the best books and films and so forth of the past year. What do you think it would take for a wholly AI-generated creative work to end up on that list?
I think we might get it with like sample-based production. So like if you think about what Kanye did, or like a classic sort of like very like genius sampler. I think somebody who could take, like, there's a website called Who Sampled that looks at like all of the rap tracks of the last like couple decades and all of the tracks they sampled. I think if you fed that in as training data and then tried to be like, make me, find me a sample that has not been used but on YouTube or whatever, right? That matches the style of the kind of sample that the following 10 genius producers used. I reckon you could make a kind of dirt off my shoulder quality beat. So like I think that I don't think you'll have so I think that's probably the one where like I believe it could happen. I think the one where I don't really believe it will happen is like complex like narratives. I think that like we are so far off like Succession being written by an AI. So yeah, like a really good, really dope rat track.
So a very good example, I think, of how you could apply the technology in a practical way, still kind of drawing on human inspiration through sampling and so forth. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where an artificial system generates a creative work at the same level as a human artist?
I think if you believe in AGI, you believe in that, right? So, like, yes, and I think that I believe that we will see areas of human endeavor where it requires, like, deep system 2 thinking, produce, like, amazing creative output, like the famous move that AlphaGo made, or like a novel mathematical proof. I think we'll see that stuff, but I think we'll see that before we see Succession, because I think that, like, I think it's like it's going to be so much easier to generate synthetic data for what like a novel piece of mathematics proof looks like than it is going to be to generate training data of like truly incredible television arcs. Because honestly, like, how many even are there? Like, there's maybe like 10 truly great television shows of all time. So like,
Succession's on the list?
No, I don't think it even is. Like, that's like the next level down, right? But yeah, to do like Sopranos or The Wire or something like that, it's like, feels like it's a long way off still. But like most of Netflix isn't that good. So like that doesn't mean we won't see.
Hopefully, there's no one from Netflix here today.
We will see stuff like, and I think we'll see music get disrupted very rapidly. It seems crazy you pay for a human to make music that just plays when you're waiting on hold or whatever, right? But like the stuff which is like, like an AI is not going to make Ulysses before it does. Like that's going to be like right next to AGI.
Cool. Well, even people who are working in AI and have worked in AI for decades are, I think, quite surprised by the progress we've seen in the last couple of years. What would you say is your own confidence score in some of the things you just talked about, or any predictions about what's coming next? And assuming that your confidence is less than 100%, and we talked a little bit about this right before, how do you personally make good decisions about what we might do in this space amidst uncertainty?
So I think I basically think the kind of bitter lesson is right. So the prediction that like all of our sort of clever, our clever algorithmic design will be trumped by simple algorithms and more compute and more data. So I basically do buy that thesis, and I believe that we haven't saturated the data available to us, and we haven't even got close to saturating the compute available to us. And I think we have an economic engine running now that means there'll be even more compute, and like the incentives to invest in the next iteration of compute are just like so obvious at this point. So, and Nvidia has a lot of free cash flow to work with. So I think we will see some, continuing like shocks to the system in terms of the capabilities of these systems. And I think like I would personally anticipate like that the scaling laws don't bend for a while. But that's, just my point of view. In terms of how I make predictions, like I guess I wear two hats. Like, so I have a sort of day job, which is trying to find the highest ambition founders working on really, amazing things and trying to support them deeply. And then I have the job where I'm working for the Prime Minister, trying to provide an empirical basis for helping make sure that these systems aren't introducing, unacceptable amounts of risk. And in the latter, the thing I've learned to do is I basically try to do a weighted average of the experts I know, and I weight it based on the quality of their historical predictions. So like if somebody has made a bet with their life, with their money, with their effort, and they made a convicted bet in 2012, for example, to start an AGI company and to bet on a bunch of things working around reinforcement learning, a bunch of things working around deep learning, like Demis and Shane did at DeepMind, they get a higher weighting in that sort of calculation because they've made bets and they've been correct. Same would be true of like Dario, Amodai, and the core team around Anthropic, who, when they were OpenAI, led GPT-1, 2, and 3. And so anyone who's made bets that have turned out to be prescient and right, I weight them higher. And so and anyone who is kind of actively bet in the wrong direction, like they were doing something completely nothing to do with AI for the last 5 years and suddenly have very strong opinions about it, I weight them lower. I think the risk of my approach is that like in any bubble, the people who are right early on can often become the most wrong later because they get attached to their own hubris and sense of confidence. So like I have like just massive error bars on it, and like I think we could have AGI. I think Shane Legg's public prediction has been pretty consistent around 2027. Like I think that's possible. Like he's been right a lot, right? But I also think it could be like decades away and really, really hard because there's some limits we hit that we don't expect. And so I think I try to approach that question with a high degree of humility. The thing that I just think is unacceptable is like for the conversation around these incredibly powerful systems that can affect everyone on Earth to be happening behind closed doors. I just think this has to be sort of I guess I'm just like fundamentally quite like committed to the democratic process and having, I think transparency and openness is very good in general. And I think we all kind of deserve a say in what we're building here.
Cool. Let's talk about those two hats that you wear a little bit more and maybe what it might mean for some of the folks in the room. So as you said, you're balancing, thinking a lot about safety and then also helping encourage founders to kind of innovate using the latest technology. Should everyone who's building with AI in the room be worrying about safety and existential risk, or should they be leaving that to you?
I don't think so. I think that I think if you're building a sort of narrow AI tool, I think it's, I guess my view on like where the risk lies is like with narrow tools like the Kieran Medical, who you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
They're building systems that can help classify breast cancer biopsy images and then other images over time. And I think that there's an existing regulator looking at that software who will judge if it's safe. And actually, the biggest risk we have on that kind of software is we don't deploy it fast enough, that we're like too kind of conservative, because I think these are, every year we lose. There's just huge cost to not adopting these systems. And so with narrow tool AI, I'm really pro going fast and trying to be sort of as light touch as possible when you can. And obviously, if you go into the judiciary or the police or the hospital, it requires a much higher standard of quality and attention to risks. But I think it's not. I think the people building that stuff should be making the case that we need to have appropriately sized regulation and to evolve the current regulators. And I think that's a useful thing to engage with. I think what I would not do, though, is conflate that into not paying attention to the biggest companies, because I think the risk is actually being created by the very largest companies who are, like Meta, have got an astonishing number of GPUs now. And if they train a model using all those GPUs, I don't think anyone at Meta can tell you what that model is going to be capable of. And so they deserve more scrutiny as a function of that. And I think that that's reasonable. And these are incredibly large companies who can actually, I think, bear that scrutiny. And what we've got to be incredibly careful of is that we end up with regulation that is actually light touch on the large companies and incredibly heavy touch on the small startup building a new novel, like Kieran, right? That would be a dragnet regulation that slows down Kieran and speed and doesn't do anything to put more guardrails around large technology company. I think would just be misguided.
That makes sense. 4 years ago, which I guess was before the current generative AI boom, I guess maybe Dario was working on GPT-2, you predicted that AI policy will become the single most important area of government policy, prescient, I think. Number one, do you still agree with that? And assuming that you do, what should we all be doing about that?
So I don't think it has become that yet, actually, which is interesting. I would say cost of living crisis or immigration seem like far more salient, inflation, far bigger issues in the eyes of political leaders around the world. I think it's shifted a lot. We hosted the Bletchley AI Safety Summit, the first global summit on AI safety, which the Prime Minister chaired. And world leaders did come to it, CEOs did come to it and talk about these issues, and we got an agreement between China, the US, Europe, across these risks. So I think it's happened, but it's definitely not the number one issue, I would say, facing politicians. I think what's tricky, though, is I think beneath the surface, the public is more concerned than is being captured by the sort of the discourse of kind of people in power. Mm-hmm. And whether that's you have power in technology because you work at a company like Stripe, or you have power because you have a senior position in the government, or you have power because you work at a big bank, or you're the editor of The Economist, right? I think the people who have power in society are less concerned than the people who don't have power in society. And if you look at focus groups and you look at polling, there's actually some really quite considerable concern around AI. And the first concern is around their job, and the second concern is around these kind of getting out of control risks. And I think that's, I've got theories as to why that is the way it is. But generally, whenever you've had the average person be pretty concerned and the average person in a position of power be not that concerned, I think usually someone figures out a short circuit that a political entrepreneur does. And we are actually pretty fortunate in this country, I think, in that the AI ecosystem in London is next to the political ecosystem in London, and I can cycle from Westminster to DeepMind and have 2 conversations right in the space of an hour. And so there is something about that allows for a little bit more convergence. And I think that what the UK government has done in establishing the AI Task Force, which I chair, and then the Safety Institute, which has become hosting the AI Safety Summit, I think we've done a bunch of stuff that means that the UK is actually taking this quite seriously. But it's definitely not the number one most salient topic amongst the political class globally.
Let's talk about your other hat. So you started your VC firm, Plural Platform, when startup valuations were riding high back in 2021. Things are obviously a little bit different now, but you just raised a huge new round, 400 million euros, to invest in European startups. Since we're here in the UK, what's the bull case and the bear case for startups in the UK right now? Okay, the bull case is that London is kind of
enough of Boston, New York, LA, and San Francisco and DC all in one city. And so, there's obviously bull cases beyond London, but like just looking at London specifically, the deepest kind of startup ecosystem we have in Europe, the bull case is like, if you are a company that's trying to blend some really, really hard science with some sort of company scaling stuff, but also a global go-to-market, like you actually have you have the pockets of talents that you can syndicate, that you can synthesize together to create something really special. And a lot of the companies that do that kind of marriage of deep technology and scaling, they often have one foot in, 2 different geographies. Like there's, like LA has a bunch of the aerospace stuff, Boston has a lot of the biotech stuff. And so I think there's something interesting at that intersection where London can produce very unique companies. The next part of the bull case is just we have a lot of talent, and historically we've had science and engineering talent but not founder talent. And I very, very strongly believe that founding is a craft that you develop as you get better. And I remember meeting, the Stripe founders when they were at their previous company, Automatic, and they were clearly brilliant, and their co-founders are brilliant, but Automatic was a terrible business, and I don't think they mind me saying that. And
I don't think they would.
And ultimately, the big thing that they probably learned is market selection really matters. You can't build a company the scale of Stripe if you pick eBay power sellers as your go-to-market, and kind of it's too thin a product, not original enough. And not differentiated enough. And so I think there's founding as a craft. The Valley has been learning how to have an ecosystem that understands that craft that has now been running since Fairchild Semiconductor, and we've got one that's now been running for decades. And I think that we'll start to see the companies come through that embody that ecosystem depth that's now emerging. And so that's the kind of other half of the bull case. I think the bear case, though, is that Silicon Valley accelerates kind of that same ecosystem depth, and the US in general accelerates so much faster than Europe that even though we've caught up, we're now just in the phase where we get left in the dust. And I do feel like there's an element of that happening at the moment with AI. I think that OpenAI, was almost an impossible company to build because you had to raise so much money and then wait like 8 years for monetization to work. And you probably couldn't have done that if you weren't Elon Musk and Sam Altman. And if they hadn't got Ilya and they hadn't got Dario, it's very, very, very contingent. It couldn't have been done by any normal founder. And I think if that hadn't happened, then DeepMind would be the most important company on the planet. And so there's kind of there's a bunch of these ways in which things are quite contingent. And I think it is possible that an amazing team in London, really, really partnered up with some of the most ambitious former founders from this ecosystem, and as investors can produce something like OpenAI, but it's a heavy lift. And so I think the bear case is just the Valley is so good still, and we consistently can get trapped in a sort of low ambition mindset outside of the Valley.
Is there any particular way that we can, this group of people in the room can address that in London, over the course of the next 6 months?
I think these things just take time. I think it can be very, very inspiring to spend time with people who have built really substantial things. All my partners at Plural, they're all former founders and CEOs, and Tarvit Hinrichs, who's one of my partners, he built Wise. It's now I think $10 billion public company. It was the largest listing on the London Stock Exchange. And I get the benefit of his judgment and wisdom and experience in every conversation I'm having about a potential investment or a company I'm working with. And so I think this just exposure to people who've done it. And I think I'm excited about the idea of how do you take founders who've got experience and have them accelerate the development and learning of a founder that's kind of just finding their craft. And if you look at the history of Silicon Valley, this is what's so special about it. Look at the history of Apple, right? And everyone thinks, it's Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and it's this kind of classic story of 2 young people just doing it off their own bats. But if Mike Markula hadn't come into the frame from, with all of the experience that he had, I don't know if it would have become quite the same thing. I certainly can, I feel very confident in saying that Meta wouldn't exist if Sean Parker hadn't got involved, because the governance structure that he created, the guidance he set early on, I think Facebook would have sold for $1 billion. And I think that wouldn't have had the choice he had as a result of maintaining control of the company. And there's tons and tons of other examples of this where this kind of experienced person in the mix can actually really change the scale and trajectory of the thing that's being built. So I think that's the big thing, and I don't think it's a fast fix, though. Unfortunately, I think it's just something that happens over time. And in Europe, it's still the case that like 90% of all VCs have never built a company. And like I just don't think that like is doing justice to generations of founders that are coming through. And so at Plural, we have 100% of the partners have built companies. And my company was never that successful. So like you be the judge of like whether you can actually how much scar tissue I have to pass on. But I think it's better than someone who's just been a banker for their career.
People often say that the UK values entrepreneurship kind of culturally less than the US, but at the same time, you're a highly technical entrepreneur, and you've been strongly embraced by kind of the establishment, if you think about politics and so forth. Do you think that's a one-off, or is there an emerging trend here?
I think there's just a global movement to understand and value startups and technology more that like I've just been lucky to be carried up by, and I think that like. I think that just in every country, it feels like people are more engaged with startups as a positive force, with technology as like just in a much more important part of the company, the economy and the way in which the world works. So, I think it's kind of happened everywhere, and I think you're seeing that happening in France and that happening in Germany, and so I feel like it's a global phenomenon, and like it's been running since sort of the last big sort of. It's really, I think YC was a big part as well of just like telling that story globally and scaling it globally.
How do you think that kind of story got from YC into the corridors of power in Westminster? Are there individuals that are helping that spread, or is everyone just listening to the same podcasts? How's it happening?
I think in Westminster today, I think that it is important to note that the Prime Minister like did spend time in the Bay Area, and so he's just got like a funny story is like we were talking about jailbreaking LLMs, and the Prime Minister was like, oh, that's like cheat codes in games was an analogy, and he was like, he was describing one of the cheat codes.
IDDQD.
Yeah, exactly. He described one of the cheat codes, and I was like, I had this moment where I was like, oh, he's actually my age, and I think that it's a youth thing. It's a historically he's just is interested in it. Like his idea, I think of like something he would just like to do with his time is talk to people from tech about what's going on and what the opportunities are. So I think it's a bit, that's probably the most contingent bit of the story here. And then like, London is that magic thing where London doesn't have the depth of any US city. It doesn't have the depth of San Francisco and tech or the depth of entertainment and as Hollywood or aerospace.
But it's
got a bit of everything, and it's all here. And that's our opportunity.
Cool. Well, you personally, or your company, has invested in 50 AI startups, so presumably you're pretty bullish on them. If you were to feed all you learned about those bullish propositions into an LLM, what's its summary? What are the commonalities you're noticing in how founders are building their businesses and the ones that you're most excited about?
I think there's something about AI where it's a very hard place to build as a founder because it's sort of become the ultimate red ocean. And so the founders that like historically that I have invested in have often been doing things that just didn't really look like very good ideas. So like, I mean, to be honest, a lot of AI looked like that for a while. Like I remember if you look at the seed round of DeepMind, 2012, it was Demis had to basically leave London to find investors, right? Because it was so non-consensus and no one would consider doing something like that. So he had to go to Hong Kong to Li Ka-shing, and he had to go to the Bay Area to find like, Peter Thiel and people like that, Elon Musk. And if you look at the seed round of OpenAI, again, really weird. The seed round Anthropic was like FTX and Jan Tarlin, right? So it's like none of the VCs that are currently like doing endless podcasts about AI invested in Anthropic, right? In that stage. And so I think there's something about going into being comfortable to go against the grain are the founders that I'm most excited about investing in, where they have a very, very distinct, carefully formed view on the world that is just not the same as what you're reading about every day on TechCrunch. And so, like I gave the example of the teams that are coming out of Carl Fristen's work. I think it's really interesting. It's not what everyone else is doing. I think the same is true of like...
Tell us about Carl Fristen's work for folks who might not be familiar.
Well, it's sort of this like universal theory of how learning works, both in a biological context and in a that can be then transferred into a computing context. And it's sort of one way of thinking about it is almost like minimizing surprise. And it's sort of this very deep, profound idea. I think he's like the most cited neuroscientist of all time, or something crazy like that. But it's basically like about trying to create, like, for example, robots that like their learning function is how to be surprised less when they navigate their environment. Like, doesn't really sound like the sort of thing that VCs would actually fund right now, because it's a bit weird. But that's the sort of thing that I personally find exciting. Another example is like Helsing. I believed it was really important in 2020 that Europe had some kind of sovereign AI defense capability. And Torsten Ryle, who's a great founder in Europe, he and I like went to try to find a company working on that, and we found this amazing team in Germany, and we led a pre-seed round in it together as angels. And I remember going around and trying to get everyone I knew to invest in it, and no one wanted to do it. It was like just universally viewed as a really terrible idea. And if you fast forward to today, Helsing has now raised like 300 million euros, and it's like got these really big defense contracts. It's kind of on the front lines in Ukraine. Torsten has actually become the CEO of the company to scale it up, and they've ripped talent out of Meta, and every VC has now got a blog or podcast about defense tech, right? And so I think there's just this thing about like being willing to be uncomfortably early, and founders have to be more uncomfortably early than investors do. I intercepted Helsing before, probably a year or two after the original founders, got working on it. And so I think it's very exposed, but if you personally wake up feeling more intellectually alive by what you're doing, and more just that sense of I would not want to be doing anything else in my time, I've always found that to be the best proxy to being onto something important ahead of the rest of the world. And so, yeah, I would do that rather than doing, the thing that you can kind of see there's going to be 10 other companies doing it. Try to have a more unique perspective, is I suppose what I'm saying.
Cool. Great insight, great advice, I think. Speaking of advice, there are probably 100 founders here in the audience today, and most of them are applying AI. With all of what you just said in mind, what advice do you have for folks literally in the room?
So I guess one piece of advice is I generally do really rate human in the loop go to market. So I think it's painful to have a human in the loop, because I'll give a concrete example. So there's a company in our portfolio called Robin AI, and they've been working on applying large language models to legal work. And what they do is they basically they go to a company and they say, you're spending a lot of money on legal right now, and that costs a lot, but it's also sometimes actually slow. And so they started off in a sector of the economy where people are willing to spend money but want something that's very fast. And that was like basically private equity firms doing NDAs and other legal documentation around deals that move quickly. And what they did is they said, this was kind of around the time of GPT-3, they said, we're going to actually have paralegals in the team reviewing what the AI produces and making edits and corrections so that we know that it's a high quality product we're delivering. And the reason for that is because lawyers, actually do produce very high quality work, and companies expect that. And so if you give them some contract that exposes them to a new legal risk, they're just not going to want that. So that go-to-market and that approach is still contrarian. I still meet founders who are doing it, and they've been told by like 10 investors they shouldn't do it, because the investor looks at it and they say, hang on a second, this doesn't scale, blah, 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 blah. But the whole point is that over time, the humans become more and more productive, and you need the same number of humans to serve 10 times the number of clients. And in the process, because you actually sell the service to the company, you're not selling, hey, buy some AI and then buy some humans and you figure out how to integrate them. They're doing the integration work on behalf of the customer. And I think that's a more compelling value proposition. And as a company, you learn how your AI is failing, and you have a much faster feedback cycle for getting smarter. So I would say that that's the number one thing that I think that founders often should do, and unfortunately, investors still encourage founders not to do, because they're pattern matching against SaaS, where you wanted to have this extremely services light approach to things.
Thanks. I think it's really practical advice that we can all use. My last question, the team at Stripe will not be surprised that I'll be asking this question. I'm not sure when the last time you used Stripe was. I know that you used it at Songkick. But if you can remember using the product, or maybe you've been using it more recently, do you have any feedback for us? We'd really like to learn how we can serve companies like Songkick and anyone in the room better. And if you don't have product advice, maybe you have some, or product feedback, maybe you have some advice for what we could be doing to help everyone in this ecosystem right now.
I think that the thing that, when I think about what does Stripe represent to me, I think it's this kind of dedication to infrastructure that makes developers more productive. And I think that like you've obviously done a huge amount within the sort of payments vertical, but it just feels like the set of things that are a pain to deal with as a developer are quite large. I mean, even in AI, it's, there's just all these things. And I think there's something about, it's still really hard to build companies. And I would say that in London, we kind of, when I was building Songkick, I remember like just the amount of pain that we had to go through to just get internet. And I hope that's not the case for any of the startups in this room. But like it really was just like there are all these things that a San Francisco company just took for granted that we had to deal with. And I think that's still the case, that there are loads of ways in which less mature ecosystems are held back from innovation compared to mature ones like the Bay Area. And look at Germany's notary processes. It's insane. Like absolutely insane how much time you have to spend to be an angel investor in a German company. And
wet ink signatures compared to DocuSign just completely changed the game.
Yeah, and so I think that the thing that Stripe could do for customers outside of the Bay Area is look at all the ways in which the founder's life in London or in Bangalore or Paris actually still sucks compared to the founder's life in San Francisco, and try to close that gap. And like Y Combinator largely, I think it, imported a lot. Y Combinator closed the gap for the Collison brothers in some ways by just getting them out of Ireland. But like I don't think that's actually like the thing that should happen now. I think it's more that we need to just like level London up to be as good as it is to build a company in San Francisco. So I think Stripe can play a role in that, because ultimately we're talking, a lot of these companies are software companies, and I'm sure almost all the companies in this room are software companies. And so for software companies, there's just still a pain to be based in Europe compared to the US. And if Stripe can do something about German notaries, you're probably going to do more for the GDP of the internet than the next incremental thing on payments, I think.
Cool. Well, Ian, thank you. That's very thought-provoking, very generous feedback and ideas. And thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and wisdom here. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks.